This presentation is about the demolition and disposal of potentially contaminated structures within Area 4, the nuclear area of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. We are not talking here about DOE-owned buildings, but rather Boeing-owned structures, including buildings in which DOE activities may have occurred. As you have heard from previous speakers, there were a number of accidents resulting in radioactive contamination throughout the area. Starting in the summer of 2012, the Boeing company began to tear all of its remaining structures down in Area 4 and to dump waste from this demolition project into disposal sites not licensed to receive radioactive waste, and to ship metals and other materials to recycling facilities. It did so for months, and with the approval of DTSC. According to records from the EPA, from the Department of Energy, and from Boeing, many of the buildings which were torn down or were about to be torn down were radiological facilities with histories of nuclear accidents and had residual radioactive contamination around them and inside of them. In May of 2013, Boeing demolished the remaining structures at the L-85 site, former location of the AE-6 nuclear reactor, which Dan mentioned earlier. According to DOE records, shown here, at least 3 separate nuclear accidents resulted in the possible release of nuclear contamination at the L-85 reactor site. This slide shows data on a site within Area 4 known as ESADA, or Empire State Atomic Development Associates, where testing of uranium and other radioactive materials occurred. Remaining structures at ESADA were demolished in March of 2013. Displayed here are screenshots from the EPA's 2012 study of Area 4's soils, showing 12 points where nuclear contamination was discovered around the ESADA site. The debris from ESADA was shipped to a disposal site not licensed to receive radioactive waste. Shown here are DOE records on another Area 4 structure, Building 4055, a facility used for plutonium fabrication. These records reveal that no fewer than 10 documented nuclear accidents resulted in possible releases of nuclear contamination in Building 4055. This facility was on the verge of being torn down and having its waste disposed of in a site not licensed for radioactive waste when a lawsuit was brought against DTSC in August of 2013 by public interest groups. Prior to the lawsuit, other radiological structures had been slated for demolition and disposal as well. Among these were remaining structures at Building 4005, an old nuclear facility. According to DOE records, shown here, the site's operation dealt extensively in both depleted and enriched uranium, and the facility experienced several accidents resulting in possible releases of nuclear contamination, including a uranium fire. Many of the structures which were demolished or were slated for demolition were radioactively contaminated, according to Boeing's records. Just from the buildings which have already been demolished, documentation submitted to DTSC prior to each structure's demolition reported numerous measurements with radioactivity above what the reports describe as background levels. These reports also show at least 17 different areas with contamination, which were even above their own criteria for what they describe as, quote, acceptable amounts of contamination. Shown here is a page from a Boeing document showing 6 separate examples of radioactive contamination in a structure which was demolished in November of 2012. In fact, with only 2 exceptions, Boeing documents identified contamination above background and above the standards which it was using in nearly every building which was demolished, including at the ESADA site, which I mentioned earlier, and at a weather station, demolished, and at a storage facility, Building 4011. Altogether, this recent Area 4 demolition project resulted in the demolition of 6 different sites and generated a large amount of waste. This raises the question of where did it all go? Much of the waste from this project, some of it contaminated, was dumped in disposal sites not licensed for radioactive waste, and the rest of it was shipped to recycling facilities. According to a DTSC document, a total of 1,963 tons of waste were dumped into landfills. Of this, 1,153 tons went to Class 1 landfills, designed for chemical waste, not radioactive waste. A further 568 tons were disposed of in Class 2 landfills, which are designed for industrial and not radioactive waste, and 242 tons went to Class 3 landfills, which are regular municipal waste dumps, again, not designed for radioactive waste. The rest of the debris was recycled, 2,925 tons in total, including 493 tons of metals, which were shipped to metal recycling facilities. 2,432 tons of asphalt and concrete were also sent for recycling. With only 2 exceptions, there is no indication that any of the waste which Boeing found to be contaminated with radioactivity was disposed of separately from the rest of the waste from the structures. This means that all of the waste, including radioactively contaminated materials,
Please be
was
respectful.
shipped
Go ahead.
to regular city garbage dumps, non-radioactive chemical waste sites, industrial landfills, or recycling facilities. So where did the waste go specifically? One of the largest recipients of the waste was a landfill in Buttonwillow in California's Central Valley. A waste manifest displayed here shows a shipment of Area 4 demolition waste which was sent there in March. The Buttonwillow facility is a Class 1 chemical waste landfill and is not licensed to receive radioactive waste. Despite that, a legal challenge from the Buttonwillow community resulted in 2003 in the facility being banned from receiving radioactively contaminated waste. The Buttonwillow landfill received hundreds of tons of waste from the Area 4 demolitions, including all of the waste from the radiological ISADA site described earlier on. Dozens of other manifests for shipments of Area 4 waste show truckload after truckload being dumped at other landfills in California, including at a Class 2 facility in McKittrick, and at Class 3 regular municipal garbage dumps in Azusa and in Lancaster. Despite the presence of contamination in many of the demolished structures, none of the facilities to which the debris was taken is licensed to receive radioactive waste. As we mentioned earlier, much of the waste from the contaminated structures was not disposed of at all, but was recycled. 2,432 tons of concrete and asphalt were sent here to Simi Valley, to the Gillibrand Company Incorporated. An example of documentation of such a shipment is shown right here. Other recycling invoices show that 493 tons of metal were shipped to a recycling facility called Kimco in Sun Valley and to another facility, Standard Industries, in Ventura. The California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, requires DTSC to prepare an environmental impact report for Area 4's cleanup. A presentation which DTSC gave in January of last year put the estimated completion of the environmental review pursuant to CEQA at 2015. A slide from that presentation, which I replicate here, shows this timeline. However, cleanup actions associated with the buildings and other structures in Area 4 already occurred from 2012 to 2013 in the form of the demolition and disposal project, which I have described, well before the completion of the environmental review required by CEQA. In response, several groups launched the lawsuit against DTSC, referenced earlier, alleging a violation of CEQA. In December of last year, the Sacramento Superior Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. It determined that there was a reasonable likelihood that DTSC had violated CEQA in permitting the Area 4 building demolitions and debris disposal before conducting environmental review. The court issued a preliminary injunction barring DTSC from approving any more teardowns and resulting disposals. Pending a final ruling in the case, no contaminated structures are being demolished and no more contaminated waste from Area 4 is being disposed of in unlicensed sites or recycling facilities. The final ruling will determine whether this outcome holds or not. And I thank you for your attention.